Hi everybody, welcome to another makeover, and in today's video I'm going to be transforming this mid-century modern media cabinet into a mid-century modern buffet. My first plan was to restore this piece because it had a record player and a radio in there, but there were some issues with the radio. For example, I could turn it on and I could hear white noise, but I couldn't catch any radio station. And the record player didn't work properly as well. The needle didn't stay on vinyl. And there was another problem. When it stayed plugged in for 5 to 7 minutes, it started to smell like something was burning in there. So I decided to take out both the radio and the record player and converted this piece into a sideboard or buffet. And first thing, I took off the shelvings which were holding the radio and the record player. Then I started removing the doors to make it easier to work with. I was gonna save the original hinges, but with me, things never go as planned. Some of them were so rusty and they got stuck into the doors, so there was no other way to take them off but to break them. And I can tell you right now that I will regret it later, because these days it's hard to find those hinges, those old hinges, the same shape of hinges. So for the pieces like that, I would always recommend to save its original hinges. I had an idea for this part of the radio, but I didn't want it to be hidden inside of the cabinet. I easily removed the glass part of the radio, but with the wooden part, I had a problem. It was joined and glued into the sideboard, so the only option I had was to use my jigsaw. The old finish was a lacquer, and on the top it was pretty thick layer. That's why I decided to strip it, and I used my favorite chemical stripper, but this time I picked liquid formula because gel formula was out of stock. And you know what? There's absolutely no difference between gel formula and liquid formula. Maybe gel formula is a little bit tiny bit thicker, and maybe liquid formula has a bit stronger smell, but they work absolutely the same. There is like $10 price difference. The liquid formula is cheaper, so for the future I think I'm gonna be buying liquid formula. And because it was a new product for me, just in case, I decided to go for the second coat, but I didn't really need it. It was kind of a waste of the stripper. So yeah, if you were hesitating buying a liquid formula, don't be. It was just as fine as the gel formula. The lacquer layer on the sides of the cabinet was pretty thin, so I decided to use my scraper instead of stripping it. I work in a basement, and that's why I use chemical stripper as less as I can. I prefer scraping, but for some stubborn areas I still had to use my stripper. My first plan was to restore this middle part, to keep it bare wood, but then I changed my mind because of two reasons. The first one, there were like 3 different types of wood in these planks. And the second reason, even if I decided to go for it to play with different types of stain to make those planks look even, I couldn't properly sand them or strip them without taking them off, but I couldn't take them off because they were glued into the piece. So I couldn't take them off without breaking them. That's why I decided to paint this part as well as insides of the cabinet. When I was done with stripping, I sanded the whole piece with 120 and 180 grit sandpaper. There is a little lighter line in the middle of the top of the cabinet. It happened while I was stripping the front part, and there was a little tiny drip and it went through whole top and it left the light line. So I'm using oxalic acid to get rid of this discoloration. And once oxalic acid dried, I washed the surface with water, and then I sanded the whole piece with 220 grit sandpaper. There was one tiny spot with chipped veneer. I filled it in with some wood filler and then smoothed it out with 220 grit sandpaper. And for the doors, I repeated the same steps, except I didn't use a stripper. I just scraped and then sanded them. And here is where the fun part begins. This board was holding old speakers and I'm going to reuse it. But first I need to get rid of this old upholstery, and I need to cut it shorter because I have an idea in my head. Remember this front part of the radio? I'm going to put it in the middle section of the cabinet on the top. Sounds kind of confusing, but you'll see it in a bit. But first I gotta measure everything to make a perfect cut. I wasn't really worried about the horizontal cuts because those parts are going to be hidden in between those planks in the middle part. But I was really careful cutting the other parts, and I put some tape to save the veneer, but it didn't happen. The veneer chipped out like you can't believe it, even underneath the tape. So I cut the edges of the veneer with the knife, and to replace this cheap veneer, I used the veneer from the leftovers of the board I just cut. I squeezed some wood glue, put the veneer on the top, and then I clamped it and let it dry. And there we go. Once the glue completely dried, I sanded this piece with 180 and 220 grit sandpaper. It was time to paint, and I had on hands two different colors of bare acrylic paint. It was leftovers from my previous project. One of them was pistachio white and the other one some type of beige color. I mixed them together and I love the color that I got. Before paint, I taped the parts I wanted to keep bare wood, and I sealed the tape with a shell lock to have sharp and crisp lines. And here I'm using blue frog tape. It's very important to use good quality of the tape. The paint I'm using here has a built-in primer, and I was hoping that I'm not gonna have any bleed-through situation. I put 3 coats of the paint, lightly sanding in between coats, and it looked good until I decided to apply a top coat. My paint had built-in top coat as well as a primer, but I decided to apply one more top coat for additional protection. Do I regret it? Yes, for sure. I didn't have any primer on hands at that time, and I was super lazy to go to the store, but I had a shellac, so I used it to seal the areas with bleed-through spots. Then I let it dry, sanded it smooth, and repainted it. I wanted to paint the base first, but then I changed my mind. Yes, I did change my mind a lot with this project. So I sanded it with 180 and 220 grit sandpaper, and I was ready to stain. So that's what I had here. First, I had beautiful walnut veneer, which I was not gonna stain, I was gonna keep it as it. Then I had a bottom board made out of poplar, and the base was solid walnut. So I needed to stain the bottom board and the base to match the veneer. And because the bottom board was the lightest one, I used two different types of stain. First, I used water-based stain in the color amaretto. And once it's dried, I stained on top of it with oil-based stain in the color Early American. And I stained the base in the same Early American color. While my stain was drying, I moved on to build the shelves. I had this particle board on hand and I cut it to the size I needed, and I painted to the same color I paint insides of the cabinet. For the other shelf, I used the piece of wood I had on hand as well, and I decided to stain it instead of painting. Because the cabinet was going to look pretty classy, I wanted to add some colors to the back panel. I sanded it smooth and started improvising. While everything was drying, I started working on the middle part of the cabinet. I wanted to use the burlap, and I wanted to paint burlap the same way I painted the back panel. I cut the piece of burlap and I used the fabric stiffener to stiff it, It just so happened that I had it on hand, but if you don't have one, you can use a school glue, maybe just dissolve it with water, but it's exactly the same thing as a fabric stiffener. I let the burlap dry, and the next day I started painting it the same way I painted the back panels. And the funny thing is, by the time I was done with painting, I didn't like it. It just didn't fit the cabinet. So I started over again with the burlap and stiffener. And for the back panels, I applied the thin layer of the white paint. I was trying to make those bright colors to look faded. Once my burlap dried, I cut the edges and I stapled it to the board. For my decorative radio element, I needed to cut this plastic radio screen without breaking it. I tried my circular saw and my jigsaw and even my multi-tool, and it didn't work. The only way I found was to use a hot knife. And I should have worn my respirator because it was pretty stinky. But it worked. And we're almost at the finish line, you guys. It was time to seal the piece and put everything together. For the top coat, I used the Otis oil, and I think it was the last time I was using it. Because after the first coat, it turned out blotchy again, and I applied the second coat, which my guess was too much for this cabinet. And after the piece was done, it stayed in my place for 2 days, and then we delivered it to the client. And then it stayed at my client's place for 3 days. On the first day, on the sides and on the top of the cabinet started appearing some type of like white film. I think it's an excess of the oil started coming out. And I know it's easy to fix with just buffing it, but I don't like having these troubles with my clients. It causes inconvenience and it's like, it's not good. And when it happened for the first time, I thought it was me. I did something wrong. But it's 2 different pieces. They were stored in different places. It was a different time of the year. So the only thing they had in common was an Otis oil. Oh, and they both were veneered furniture. Maybe that's a problem. And the solution probably would be to apply just the one coat. But with just the one coat, it looked blotchy. Or to wait until the piece fully cured, 7 to 14 days. But I do this for a living and I want to sell as fast as it possible, and I don't want to store the pieces in my house because I don't have enough room. And with other finishes, I have never had those problems, so I think we're done with Otis oil here. At least for the veneer, because with solid wood it works just fine. But I'm definitely gonna miss the smell of Otis oil. And if you're new here, I mean in furniture flipping, and you've never heard about Otis oil before, this is some type of tung oil. It penetrates into the wood fiber and it creates nice and even top coat when it doesn't turn out blotchy. And what I love about Otis oil, there's no chemicals at all. It's all natural, you can apply it with bare hands. And the coverage of an oil, you can't believe it. One little jar will last you like forever. By this time, I have finished 7 pieces with Otis oil and I still have a quarter of the jar left. That is why I didn't give up on Otis oil after the first fail. And you know what? Maybe I'll give it a try again, but only with solid wood. And after almost 14 minutes of this video and probably 4 days, in reality, the pieces started coming together. I drilled the holes in the sides of the cabinet and I put some dowels in there to hold my shelves. I ordered new hinges on Amazon and guess what? They won't fit. And the next half of the day I spent trying to figure them out. I used washers, I used different type of screws, and finally it was done. I said it before and I'm gonna say it again. With old pieces like this, try to save its original hinges. And there it goes my burlap part, and if you were wondering why there is an empty spot on top, that is for my decorative radio. Isn't it pretty? And for the back side of my radio, I used this salvaged piece of felt. I attached the backboard and we're done here, guys. Let me remind you what I started with. And here's the final result.